You are a American of African descent, and thus African American. Just like Chinese born here are Americans of Chinese descent or European, they are American of European descent. This is not a difficult concept. Well, thank you, Kanisha, for your comment and question. And if anyone else has any comments or questions, make sure to leave them down below and make sure that they're well thought out and well put together. Now, we're going to deal with this first part in this in what you left, and the other part about staying black we're going to deal with on another separate video. So I understand what you're saying. You're saying that just like the Chinese who immigrated over to America and had offspring which identify themselves as Americans of Chinese descent, so should it be with other Americans who are of African descent, right? And you're also saying that they should call themselves American Africans. And on top of that, what you're saying is that that's what I should do as well, right? And so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to give you two reasons why this is not an exact correlation and why this is not true for me, right? And so the first reason is a cultural reason. Now you have to understand that the Chinese Americans, they retain some level of cultural connection to their ancestral homeland. And that's because many of them, they're not many generations removed from it, okay? And so they still eat a lot of the same foods. Many of them still speak their ancestral language, or they at least understand it to some degree. And for example, when I was in the Marines, I served with someone who was of Chinese descent, right? He was a first generation Chinese American, but he still spoke the Mandarin dialect. And on top of that, he still ate a lot of the native Chinese foods, right? He understood that culture. And so this also applies to other immigrants across the board. And so, for example, one of my best friends is Vietnamese American, right? He's a first generation American, but he still speaks Vietnamese. He also cooks and he also eats Vietnamese food, right? He still retains some of the Vietnamese culture, right? Because his parents are Vietnamese. And so they passed it down onto him, right? And a lot of his outlook is also Vietnamese and is combined with the American culture and outlook as well, right? And so growing up, I've had a lot of friends from various backgrounds, right? From Filipino, Mexican, Guatemalan, Cambodian, Laos, Thai, and friends of other ancestry who still retain some level of their ancestral cultural heritage or background, but it's blended with an American culture. Understand? And that's why they can rightly call themselves Chinese American or Filipino American or Vietnamese American, right? That's why they can do that. But that's a completely different story than a group of people whose ancestors have been here before the country was even a country, right? They've been on this land before it was even called America. And what's even more of a difference is that the people who call themselves black people have a good portion of their African ancestry who came to this land as slaves. And so during the enslavement process, every ounce of the African culture and identity was purged out of those people, right? Which gave rise to the creation of a new identity and a new culture called Negroes or black people and Negro or black culture. And this culture was not rooted in Africa, but rather in the slave South, right? With the influence coming in from the ghetto redneck Southerners of European descent. Understand? And what was involved in this Negro culture were things like Ebonics, which did not come from Africa. Things like chitlins and hog maws, which were not cultural cuisines that came from Africa. Jesus and the Baptist Church, which did not have their origins in Africa, right? And later on, this culture and this mindset made further developments, right, into what we see today. Self-hate being one of the characteristics of a black person that evolved into things like weaves and perms, which did not have their root in Africa, right? Mean mugging each other, hatred, all these things, staring down the cars when you come through and come past. These things did not come from Africa. Bloods and Crips, which also did not come from Africa, and many more things that make black Americans or African Americans culturally distinct from the people that live in Africa, right? This is a completely different thing than the immigrants that came here to America and passed on aspects of their homeland heritage to their American-born offspring. So that's number one. And number two is genetics. And for some reason, this is a topic here that a lot of people refuse to be realistic about, right? And that is that most people who identify themselves as black in America do not come from a 100% African ancestry. Unlike the Chinese, who come here as fully Chinese, and they have children that tend to marry into the Chinese bloodline, the black person or the African American cannot proclaim the same thing. Right here in this book here, it's called Ancient DNA and the New Science of the Human Past by geneticist Dr. David Rich, or Reich. I think that's how you pronounce it. This is on page 223. That's where it's at. This is what it says on here. It says, Katarzyna Bryce at the personal ancestry testing company 23andMe worked with me to analyze more than 5,000 self-described African Americans in the company database and found that the average European ancestry proportion was 27% in most of the genome. And then what it goes on to talk about is how most of the European descent is coming from a male of European descent, right? Which is, or it was 4 times greater than the contribution of the European woman. And so what this means is that the people who self-identified as African American, those people, they have European fathers somewhere down in their bloodline somewhere, right? That's what made up the majority of their European ancestry. And that's okay. There's no problem with that, right? You are who you are. Now, for me, I don't self-identify as African American or black or anything else like that, right? I identify as Earpoids. And so my DNA shows about 64.6% of my ancestors came from sub-Saharan Africa, right? Not 100%, but 64.6%, right? That means that close to 35% of my ancestors are not from that region. That's the reality of the situation. Understand, not something that I'm imagining or wanting to be true. That's what is real. And so for me to act as if that's not the case, that would make me a delusional person. And it would make me a person that is not grounded in reality. And so claiming that I'm only of African descent or I'm only an American African, that would fall under that delusion, right? At least in my approach and in my opinion, right? You may not agree with that, and that's completely fine because you have the ability to have your own opinion, right? And so African ancestry from various parts of the continent, it makes up about 65% of my DNA. Then next in line is European with 27.5%, with most of those ancestors being English, followed by German and French and so forth. And remember how we talked about how most of the people who self-identify as African Americans have European ancestry that is largely from a European that was a male? Well, that's not the case with me. Most of them, they have European males somewhere down in their lineage, but they don't know where that male is located at exactly, right? I don't have that uncertainty because I know exactly where my European ancestry come from, right? It comes from my father's mother, who is 100% of European ancestry, right? And so the English, the French, the German, and the Jewish ancestry that we see on here all come from her, right? And my father's father is primarily of African descent, with probably some Native American descent in there as well. And so is my mother's mother. Now, we have the 5.5% of my DNA that comes from people who are native to this land that I live on right here. And so some of my ancestors have been living right here in America for thousands of years, right? That's part of the reality of my genetic makeup, right? That's the reality. And so this DNA of the Native American is coming primarily from my mother's father. And probably, as I said, it's probably coming some from my mother's mother and also from my father's father as well. And so then we have another 1% of my DNA that's coming from East Asia, and another 1% is coming from the Levant region. And so this is the reality of the situation. And it's so real that even if any of these genetics were removed, then I would look like a completely different person, right? I wouldn't have the same makeup, the same color of skin, the same structure of the face. It would be different, right? That's the reality. And so to recap, one, there's no passing down of the African culture and the African traditions that have survived the generations of slavery that we can point to today and say, that's African, right? It just doesn't exist. And in fact, it's the mindset and the culture that they were forced to develop during that slavery time. That's the very thing that we eventually had to escape during the final phase of freeing our minds. Understand? And two, there has been a mixing that had occurred within America and that is still occurring between African and European ancestry over time and even until today, which has caused people to not be entirely African or not be entirely of European descent, right? And so in other words, it had created a genetically different people. Understand? Just like it did in Puerto Rico, just like it did in the Dominican Republic, right? It's just that the people over in America, they're stuck with the name black, right? And most of them, they haven't reached the consciousness that would allow them to be able to understand that they can get past that identity, right? And other of them, they just simply don't care at all, which is fine too, right? There's no problem with that. If they want to keep that, they can keep that, right? That's up to them. Now, if you want to be called an American African or you want to be called African American, then I don't have a problem calling you that at all, right? I have zero problem acknowledging that that's what you want to be called, right? And I'm pretty sure you have your own reasons for wanting to identify as that. And I respect those reasons for you, right? Just as I respect people's wishes to want to be called black, or if they want to be called white, or whatever they want to be called, right? If they want to be called those identities, I will call them that, no problem. But I don't identify with any of those names, right? We have our own cultural identity, and we call ourselves Earpois, right? People of the free world, right? And we're not confused about that identity. And neither are we trying to force that identity on other people who don't want to be that. And also, this identity is not based on a bloodline or a color. It's based on a character that's within. That's how we identify, and that's who we want to identify with. And so I want to thank you for leaving your comment, and hopefully you've been provided with something that has given you some type of other understanding. And so anyone else who has any type of comment or question, make sure that you leave it down below. And I want to thank you for watching all the way until the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.